and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be considering a topic which comes up surprisingly often, but is explained very rarely. I remember when I was a young student, performing for pedagogues and performers in lessons and masterclasses, I would occasionally be asked by them to be more imaginative with my playing, or to use more imagination in a given phrase or interpretation. Similarly, I find that I sometimes say the same thing to my own students, and without thinking, I assume that they know exactly what I mean. Of course, the only way to assure this is to explain them what I mean in a more in-depth and hopefully more precise way. But it got me thinking about how these shorthands in language can be utterly confusing to students, and why it's necessary to really pull apart the generic understanding that we have when speaking in musical parlance. So, today's episode, to my pleasant surprise, presents a question that one would literally ask a pianist. What do you mean when you say, play more imaginatively? The perception of imagination is grounded on a listener's expectation, and how this expectation is met and exceeded by the performer. However, in order to establish this frame of reference, we have to first consider what is expected musically in a given circumstance. Consider this famous theme from the first piano concerto of Chopin, played in a generic, rather harmless way. Now, one element of Chopin that is pretty much non-negotiable when it comes to musical interpretation is that of application of rubato. Obviously, the phrase cannot be played with a strict tempo, and it would suffer horribly if done so. Like this. To be clear, it's not that the music itself doesn't work in terms of harmony or counterpoint. It's that the music is built and organized according to the expectation that time will be taken at strategic points. The general rule of thumb in Chopin when it comes to rubato is to have one rubato moment per phrase. Having less can be effective in certain circumstances, but having many more can be positively destructive. Here's what I mean. The first part of the phrase is a neat four-bar melody. Now, given the markings and hairpins, it's a reasonable assumption that Chopin would like us to take some time at the top of the phrase towards the end. This lines up nicely with the change in harmony and gesture. The second part of the phrase mirrors the first rhythmically, so once again, it's a reasonable assumption to do the same thing here. Take time in the middle towards the end. There's an added bonus to the second part of the phrase. We have a rather lovely harmony created in this moment of time. So, once again, we can make a reasonable assumption that Chopin would like us to take even more time here to give the audience time to enjoy what he's written. In full, we get something like this. This is a baseline of interpreting Chopin in terms of rubato usage. We have one per phrase, and they're placed nicely and in an inoffensive quantity. If we exceed the number of rubatos, or increase the intensity of each rubato, then we will be exceeding expectations, and fulfilling the need to play imaginatively. It's guaranteed to work, right? Wrong. Overloading the intensity of the given rubatos is the first major error that inexperienced pianists commit. If I were to take the rubato moments that I outlined before and increase their intensity to a breaking point, we get something like this. The natural tendency here, and the reason why it's so easy to do this, is that we appeal to our own emotions and how they are affected by the music, rather than how this music will affect others. The assumption, often incorrect, is that if we are moved by the music, then others will be too. Furthermore, we tend to forget that we're the ones who practice this music for hours a day for months on end, and thus we become deaf to the special moments that this music can create for someone hearing it for the first time. We have to exaggerate the moment in order to feel it ourselves, all the while assuming that this is ideal for our audience. There are, of course, other problems that are generated by an increase of intensity. If our hierarchy of rubato is to remain in form, then if we increase the intensity of the first rubato moment, we have to increase the second one proportionally. In other words, we get something that grinds to a halt by the end. The other strategy used by inexperienced pianists is to increase the number of rubato moments in order to say something that no one has said before. To quote Shakespeare, to be, or not to be. Another term for this is milking the phrase. There are some who enjoy this form of indulgence, but I think it's a dangerous thing to have if the music has substance. If the music is empty or meaningless, then this artificial creation of moments is necessary in order to give the audience something to latch onto. But Chopin is a far better composer than that, and his music can communicate more directly if we obscure it less. In this musical case, the concept of playing imaginatively involves first establishing a baseline interpretation, which is expected of the music in terms of rubato and the shape of phrase, and then the next step is to find ways of enhancing or highlighting the meaning you attach to the phrase or the meaning you intend on communicating to the audience, without disrupting that baseline expected interpretation. It's like adding a little salt and pepper to eggs and bacon, which is a far different situation to replacing the bacon with soy that looks like bacon. what elements of musical interpretation can we adapt or adjust so that we can create a more unique and personal interpretation? Since we can't really fool around with the intensity of our rubato and the declaration of where that rubato goes, and because Chopin meticulously marks where he wants crescendi and decrescendi, we're left looking at elements of sound production, which really are left undocumented in the score. First, what kind of sound do we want for the total melodic effect? Do we want a phrase that sings out regardless of the musical situation? Do we want a transparent, almost fragile sound that might be more akin to a small bird singing, perhaps? Furthermore, do we want to change our sound production as we go? So, for example, the first part of the phrase is light and transparent, and the second is deeper, with more body to the sound. We can go even further than this, of course. Why don't we start altering our sound production during the rubato moments, to increase the effect, but not the time taken? The expectation is to drive to the beautiful harmony here. Now, putting in a sudden drop might be useful, though contrary to the harmony and risking criticism of sounding like a gimmick. But nevertheless, it is imaginative to an extent. We're taking expectations and either adding to them or contradicting them within the confines of the musical aesthetic. Voicing is directly connected with sound production, and this again is a vector in which we can explore imaginative playing. Chopin enjoys using thirds and sixths to bolster the harmony in the melody, and it is tempting to highlight this. A simple option is to play these notes in the left hand staccato in pedal, with everything else the usual legato. This creates a different sound quality which shines to an audience, but doesn't interfere with the melody on top, like fireflies at dusk. Similarly, we can make the choice to highlight the bass line, which is usually forgotten but is extremely important. We make long-sounding full bass notes, like this. the melody a very different support than it had before. These are elements which bring a sense of imagination to a standard interpretation, because they create a new version of the same piece we've heard before, and shine spotlights on elements of the musical construction that we may normally pass over. The purpose of playing imaginatively is to create a twofold effect. On the casual audience member, they'll think, but of course, this has to be played this way. It can't be played any other way. To the musician who knows the music well, they should think, why didn't I think of that? Because the extensions we've made to the interpretation come from an origin within the music, there is an illusion of inevitability about it. The phrase must go in this direction, or it must be played this way. This is another way of saying that your interpretation is convincing. You've constructed an interpretation that is internally infallible. This is not to say that it cannot be done another way. What I'm saying is that there are no contradictions in a specific interpretation to hint to the audience that it can be another way. It's difficult to do, no doubt about it, but it's necessary, especially when you are playing a piece as famous as this one. There can be no room for doubt in the minds of an audience, and the way to create that is to have no doubt within yourself. Expectation is dependent upon the composer and their style. Let's look at some Mozart, in which the rules of aesthetic are different, but the core of the argument remains the same. This is yet another famous theme from a concerto, but unlike the Chopin, where we must be concerned about rubato and expression based on taking time, here the priority is in articulation, a steady tempo, and subtlety in sound production and silence. We can build our interpretation using the same method as with the Chopin. Create what is expected, and then add to it in creative but internally cohesive ways. So, what is the expectation here? First, 8-bar phrases in Mozart tend to follow the rhetorical plan of asking a question and answering that question. We have the first 4 bars, ending in a question, and the last 4 answering that question in the affirmative. In terms of pure mathematics, this is similar to the Chopin example from before. Classical aesthetics in music tend to champion the idea of balance within architecture, with small ornaments that beautify but do not interfere with that balance. That's why, as an example, this phrase only has 1 ornament in it, and it occurs on a long note. Balance is best measured between 2 ideas that are clearly formed. The more random and dissimilar objects we have on each side, the harder it is to figure out which side is heavier. Mozart essentially burns away all extraneous issues, leaving a melody that is clear. This is why the addition of severe rubato, as an example, would ruin this aesthetic. The strength of the clarity in form is dependent upon a rhythm that is steady and relatively unchanging. If we play around with the rhythm, then we change the timing construct of the phrase, pulling the phrase out of balance. stop here for a moment to talk about something very important. Aesthetic differences, though we label them as the cause of the difference in interpretation, are really a result of the choices a composer makes regarding what they think is most important to communicate to an audience and how best to do it. In Chopin, we have many cases of him slowing down the structural progress in order to focus on a moment in time, as if that moment can be removed from the structure entirely and enjoyed for its own beauty, like cutting a rose from a garden and putting it into a single vase. In Mozart, the beauty comes from the perception of the whole piece and the functions of each part within. Instead of cutting a single rose out and looking at it, we're admiring the whole garden in all its splendor and variety of color, looking at one flower and then another, and then an entire plant, and so forth. Remove a flower, and a corner of the garden looks a little strange. Remove an entire plant or species, and the garden fails entirely. In order for us to perceive the piece of music as a whole in Mozart, there is little choice but to make many elements of the music either redundant or predictable, so that the audience can focus on what is unique within that construct. Having a regular rhythmic pulse, which is standard in Mozart, is a perfect example of this. We don't pay attention to the rhythm at all once it is set up in the first bar. We pay attention to the changing harmony, the melodic balance, all the other elements of change that exist in a construct of stasis. So, our expectation in this aesthetic is a steady rhythm, precise articulation, and dynamics, which tend to follow the movement of the pitches. If the notes go down in pitch, we might decrescendo, and if they go up, we might crescendo. This leads us to a baseline interpretation like this. Now, we cannot use the same interpretational devices we used in the Chopin to make things sound a little more imaginative. Adjusting our rhythm and pulse will not do this, and there's very little we can do in terms of selective or creative voicing. The texture is already transparent enough that the audience can hear everything regardless of how loud we play the melody. So, what do? Well, we use the same approach we used in the Chopin. Identify the elements of this style that are used by the composer to communicate, and amplify or contradict them. With Mozart, articulation is a big issue. The melody has a section that is legato, or bowed, as I would say. And he has a contrasting section that is detached, but not staccato. Furthermore, the slurs have their own set of expectations, in that they should always start louder than they end. We can adjust these parameters slightly to create something more expressive. Exaggerating the beginning of the slur that starts at the beginning of a bar is a good place to start. Instead of putting a slight accent on the beginning of this slur, we can try taking a little bit of time just before and on the beat, for the sole purpose of giving the sound of the note time to decay and result in a natural decrescendo. We can do something in the same vein, but on a much more subtle level on the beginning of the slur in bar 2. Instead of this, we can lean into it a little bit, taking a bit of time at the top. On the opposite side of the articulation spectrum, the detached notes in the third bar can accommodate slight accenting on the main beats. Instead of 4 equal eighth notes, like this, we can have an accent on the first and third notes, like this. Lastly, we can adjust our sound production in slight but powerful ways. The 3rd and 7th bars are identical except for the notes in the left hand. We can make a difference in this, in terms of sound quality, to indicate to the audience that the phrase is continuing the first time, but ending the second. In practical terms, this means making the sound transparent and more percussive for the first set, and heavier and more cushioned the second. Now, let's put it all together. In order for creativity and imagination to be perceived by the audience, we always have to find a way to fulfill their expectations first. These expectations are based on the performance traditions as found on recordings, and as practiced by current musicians. Obviously, it's nearly impossible to make everyone happy, but if you understand the elements of performance that drive the aesthetic or style you're trying to represent, then you can figure out ways to not only fulfill them, but exceed them within the bounds of good taste. To play imaginatively is to do just that, fulfill and exceed expectations in a tasteful way. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and always try to figure out what elements of music drive the piece you happen to be playing. Each style, each composer has their own set of rules, and only by knowing the rules can you fulfill them and break them. Bye for now.